tribute to his brother.
Firstly, we would like to thank you all, both inside and outside this church, for coming today. It means a lot to us. And firstly, I want to speak briefly about the manner of Rory's death. Those who are close to Rory have feared this day for a long time. There are those among us who feel anger towards him for his actions in the last years of his life. And there are those of us who feel guilt that there was nothing we could do or say to prevent this day. And there are those of us who feel both. But the fact is, this is not a problem unique to Rory. This pattern exists going back generations within his own family and within many other families the world over. In the end, there were words and actions that Rory would never have dreamed of had he still been the man he was born to be. It is easily said, but those of us who feel anger towards him must try to forgive him for our own sake and for our own peace of mind. I know that my mum and stepdad John, in particular, have tried so hard, and they suffered a great deal in the whirlwind of Rory's alcoholism. I have talked to some of his closest friends in the past 2 weeks, and all of them have searched for something they could have done differently to pull Rory out of the final dive that took him. I am convinced there is nothing. They should feel no guilt at all. They were tolerant and understanding above and beyond what could have been expected of them. But if this was all there was to Rory, the high street would not be lined with people this afternoon, and there would not be people standing outside in the churchyard. It was a small part of his story, and one that should not overshadow his real nature or who he really was at his best. The stories of Rory are legion, and I have only time for a few of them here. Truth be told, some of them would be best left for outside the church. This church is where our dad had his funeral in 1986. We worked out the other day Rory was 31 days younger than our dad was on the day of his death. Our eldest brother Andrew also had his funeral here 20 years later in 2006. He had 8 years less than either of them. So we are here again today because Rory, who was the fifth of us, as always, jumped the queue. And in his never-ending need to be the centre of attention, he did it on my birthday. As my mum said, he came into this world on August 22nd, 1970, when he arrived before the midwife could get there, and he continued in his life in that way. He was one of 3 of us born at home in the village of Wylam, Northumberland, just outside Newcastle, and this would later shape a great deal of his life. His bond with his mother was close from the day he was born, and being the youngest boy, some of us felt he got away with murder. As I said, Rory came into the world in a hurry, and sometimes he seemed to be in a hurry to get out of it. To say he had 9 lives would be something of an understatement. I have a vivid memory of him as a toddler grinning at me as he opened a car door handle and promptly disappeared out of a moving car onto a Hartlepool roadside. I don't think he even went to casualty to get checked out that time. There were numerous other occasions that did merit a visit to hospital. I remember a collision with a car on his bike. I remember blood spurting up a bathroom wall when he put his fist through the window, and I remember numerous concussions. Ellis and Owen have no idea how miraculous their existence in this world is. Rory lived in 7 houses by the time he was 8 years old, and a lot of this was down to the employment difficulties our dad had in the northeast of England at that time, which eventually meant a move south. The last of these 7 houses was in Abbots Road, just through the churchyard there. And we were reminded on the Facebook group by Andrew Pickervance, who lived a few houses down,
about a game that I'm pretty sure Rory was instrumental in devising shortly after we took up residence. We would pile up a load of building material we found in the garage, old doors, wooden frames and fencing, into a barricade in the back garden. Then some of us had to hide behind this barricade while the others threw loose bricks and empty milk bottles at it. Those who remember the social strife that existed in this country at that time may perhaps understand why this game became known as Brixton. For those of us who are asking why, you have to remember there were only 3 channels on the telly in those days, and we weren't really Blue Peter type kids. Quite what the rest of the neighbours in Abbots Road made of this social commentary theatre piece, I have no idea. Most of us thought we would not be long in Abbots because we were never really long anywhere in those days, and I think most of us thought a move back north would happen sooner or later. But this time, for some reason, we stuck it out, much to the delight of the neighbours. Rory was always more gregarious than most, and he soon had his circle of friends, mostly from the Summerhouse Way estate. This is how we came to know Stephen Proctor and his family. My dad was forever trying to find Rory around the Proctor household in those days. Decades later, Stephen is quite simply the 9th Wilson. Throughout his youth, Rory turned 108 Abbots Road into the alternative Abbots Langley Youth Club. Nobody knocked on the front door, everyone just went round the back and walked in. We would come home to find his friends all over the house and our VHS video recorder constantly replaying episodes of Auf Wiedersehen. Back then, if you didn't know every line from series 1 and 2, you weren't really in the club. Now, at about this time, I started taking trips back north to watch Newcastle. Home games then involved overnight coach trips on a Friday with a return on Saturday night. Our dad promptly followed, and true to form, he found a better and cheaper way of doing this by joining the London Supporters Club. Through them, we could get return train tickets for the Saturday. Rory, ever on the lookout for something of interest, soon tagged along. True to form, he was a pain in the arse. Most kids of his age collected programmes and scarves as souvenirs. Rory decided he liked pieces of intercity trains. I remember one Saturday evening, the 3 of us being pursued across the platform at King's Cross by an irate guard as Rory tried to stuff a British Rail headdress down his jacket. But I watched something happen to Rory on those first trips. The Gallowgate End was a fairly lawless place back then. The fans were raucous, fanatical, and largely out of control. A baying mob that could clearly influence events on the pitch. Rory looked at this and he fell in love. In spirit and in the geography of his birth, these were his people. Some of them also drank a fair bit, but that came later. I will always cherish the long train journeys with them, discussing the ins and outs of the team and the club, but in amongst the laughs, there was an incident which will always remain one of my strongest memories of Rory. Something his great friend John Blunden said to me a few days after Rory's death was that he would go to the wall for you. When I was about 20, I was set upon by some Millwall fans who had sussed us on one of those trains. Rory, all 5'4" and 14 years old, jumped in the middle, and this saved me when the whole thing became a joke to them. But Rory was serious enough. Nobody messed with his family or his friends. Somehow, Rory managed to gate crash several cup finals in the 80s to which he was not technically invited, i.e. Newcastle weren't playing and he didn't have a ticket. It was on returning from one of these trips he used up another of his 9 lives. The M25 was still being built just up the hill from King's Langley Station, and parked alongside the works was a convenient steamroller that Rory and Dave Dickinson decided to take for a joyride. Eventually, the inevitable happened, and as this steamroller careered over the edge of the bank, Dave had the sense to jump clear. Not so Rory. Dave looked on as the JCB somersaulted end over end down the bank, sure he had seen the last of Rory, until at the bottom he emerged from the cab looking like a dazed mole. He always had natural physical strength and started working on building sites, originally hod carrying and then bricklaying. He had lots of jobs, but the times he worked for John Blunden seemed to have been by far the best for him. Something else John told me the other day also rang very true. If somebody knocked John for payment, Rory would take this as a personal insult. Such was his loyalty to those he valued. Many of the people he worked with will be inside and outside this church now. Around this time, he became part of Abbots Langley's own rave scene and began to DJ in the local pubs, eventually graduating into pubs in London. I'm told by those who know he was good at it. He once followed a set by Ray Keith, who was the resident DJ at Astoria, and I'm told this was a pretty big thing back then. I was talking to Jay Johnston last night, another of Rory's friends who tried so hard to pull him back from the edge in his final days. Jay was telling me of the night he was driving home from Astoria in the early hours of a Sunday with a car load of 8 people, which included Rory in the boot. Someone in Camden High Street, he tail-ended the car in front, and after the initial crash, there was the eerie silence that so often follows a car accident. This was broken by gales of laughter from the boot. Somehow, Jay made it all the way back from Camden to Abbots with no lights and the front of the car staved in. Then, as luck would have it, at about 6 in the morning, or bad luck would have it, on the roundabout, just out the front there, he was spotted by a police car and followed back to everybody's favourite home base, 108 Abbots Road. At this point, our mum emerged from the house and harangued the policeman. "You leave him alone, he's a good boy." Now, what is unusual about that story is that she was defending Jay, because as we all know, usually that was her battle cry when she was defending Rory. Another of the 8 people in that car went by the name of Debbie Barber. There were many girlfriends in and out of Rory's life. Some lasted longer than others. Some hours, some minutes. When he was 20, he met Debbie, who would go on to become his wife. The prevailing view among the family is that she was the only woman who ever had any control over Rory, with the possible temporary exception of our mum. And it was on holiday with Debbie in Magaluf that Rory met Neil Minto, who has travelled all the way from Newcastle to be here this afternoon. His presence would have meant a great deal to Rory. Rory and Debbie were married in the Dominican Republic in 1998, and it is a great regret for me that I was not there. I have seen the pictures, and I have an inkling of what I missed. In 2001, Ellis was born, followed by Owen in 2005. They were his pride and joy, and in the beginning, this was obvious. It seemed from the outside that Rory's life should have been complete, with a family he loved, working with people he loved, but he knew, we know, this was not to be. Rory's alcoholism eventually robbed Debbie of a marriage, and Ellis and Owen of the best of their father. It is the saddest part of Rory's story that this is so. For a while, it may seem to Ellis and Owen that this was the main part of his life. I hope that the number of people in here today and down the high street will give them a glimpse of the regard in which their father was held. I know that in the last conversations they had with their dad, he told them he was proud of them. Ellis for getting a first in his essay on the Vietnam War, and Owen for winning a football match. I know he would want them to hold on to that and other good memories they have. Remember the football, remember the fishing, and everything else that happened during his periods in recovery. I hope in time you can let go the rest. It is just dross, and it is no good to you. Since his death, I realised there were large parts of Rory's life story separate from mine. There are so many of you here I do not know. I have only had time to mention a few of you. For those of you I have not mentioned, for those who were with Rory in the good times and the bad, you know who you are. From all the family, from the bottom of our hearts, we thank you. And there's more. We must go on now without Rory but I hope you will all in the end remember just the best of him. I have struggled to find the words to close this eulogy. In the end, I have to go with something here which harks back to the days of the Abbots Road Youth Club. I'm afraid if you know, you know. If you don't, you don't. So, in the end, in the words of the great Timothy Spall, a.k.a. Barry Taylor, ta-ra for a bit, Rory.